Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. Let us listen for the word of God. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out at about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. As soon as I got done reading this letter on Friday, I was flustered. I didn't expect to hear that we would be put on the wait list for the local pre-K program. My neighbors assured me there would not be a problem. They said there's never been a wait list in the past, but this year was different. Friends started to text and find out if we got in. We were comparing notes. And while this decision about putting our eldest in pre-K didn't stress me out before, all of a sudden, I was flustered. I can almost understand why those celebrities bribed those colleges to get their kids in. Almost. I would never go that far. What they did was awful. But I'm realizing that as a parent, I want what's best for my kids. But sometimes that comes at the cost of my care for other people's kids. Upon hearing from others who got in, my first reaction was, "We've lived in this neighborhood longer." And even more absurd, "But we live closer to the school. They're all the way on the other side of the neighborhood. Surely we are more worthy of getting into this school, right?" That's where my sense of entitlement crept in. And I realized I was being like those laborers, grumbling at getting paid the same amount as those who only worked an hour. I momentarily forgot what they said when we turned in the application, that in the unlikely event that there would be way more applicants than spots, they would hold a lottery. They would draw names at random. They would fill those spots. There was no ranking system. Nobody got priority. Just a random lottery. There's nothing about our family that makes us more deserving of a spot than any other, but I forgot that when I opened that letter. I think perhaps it helped me to read through this news about pre-K. It helped me to keep my entitlement in check beyond that initial moment of absurdity. And I was able to remember that we are privileged to live in an area where there are lots of good pre-K options. We're going to be just fine. Well, even though I find this parable challenging, I was thankful for it this week, especially in that moment. In this parable about the vineyard, Jesus reveals a truth about the kingdom of heaven. This truth challenges our notion of fairness and justice. We're told about this landowner who goes into town to the market searching for laborers. This is similar to the scene outside the Home Depot all across the country, where workers show up hoping to be hired for the day. Back in Jesus' time, there were no temp agencies to connect you to jobs. You just had to go into the market and hope to be picked. Well, there were some who were fortunate on this particular day. The landowner brought them to the vineyard. If you'll recall a few weeks ago when I introduced the series on parables, I mentioned that there's always an absurd element to them. There's always something that just doesn't quite make sense. These aren't logical stories with their meaning right there on the surface. We have to dig a little bit. We have to read between the lines to get at what Jesus is trying to say, and even then, we never completely get it. These parables are complex, and they often have multiple meanings, but they are worth sitting with and pondering over. Well, the first odd detail to notice in this story is that the landowner goes out to find the workers. This is rather unusual. He has a manager. That's his job. He should be the one seeking out the workers. The landowner wouldn't typically have anything to do with this part of the process. He should be spending his day idly by at his villa, enjoying his wealth. It's peculiar that the owner goes out to hire the workers. The second odd detail to notice is that he returns multiple times throughout the day. Surely he could have selected enough workers right from the start, decided how many to hire, and only have to make one trip into town. He goes there multiple times, first at dawn, then at 9 and noon, 3 and 5 in the evening, each time hiring more workers, bringing them to the vineyard. This isn't a very efficient way to spend his day. My husband jokes that a house project isn't complete until you've made at least 3 trips to the home improvement store. Jimmy knows. And then with Austin traffic, you really spend more time in the car and at the store than you do working on the project itself. Maybe the landowner just didn't estimate correctly. He didn't know how many workers he needed. Was there more work as the day wore on? Or did he know exactly what he was doing? I wonder, was he more concerned about making sure these laborers were given work and given pay? We can't be sure from Jesus' telling. We aren't given those details. But there's another odd detail to notice, which is the laborers themselves. We might speculate that the ones chosen at 3 or at 5 were lazy. Maybe they slept in and missed that first call for work at dawn. Perhaps they just weren't good workers. Maybe they were the kids picked last in gym class because they weren't strong enough or fast enough. But the landowner asks them why they have been idle out there all day. They too showed up early. They were available. They wanted to work. They just weren't given the opportunity. It isn't that they're lazy or incompetent. There just wasn't work for them. Well, they persevered. They waited until evening, hoping that someone would hire them. So we've got this landowner who personally seeks out these workers. He goes out multiple times a day, sort of wasting a lot of time seeking out more workers. And these workers, they wait all day in the marketplace, waiting for someone to hire them. Fortunately, the landowner hires all of them, pays them all the same wage, and according to Jesus, this is what the kingdom of heaven looks like. Regardless of when the workers started their shift, they all get paid the same. Now, it's possible to look at this parable through the lens of salvation, to explore what's called the eschatology behind this story. It's a big word for the end times or future hope, talking about heaven and hell, that sort of stuff. It's possible to make the comparison of when people come to know Christ, that whether you arrive at the faith early as a child or later in life, you're all equal in God's eyes. We all get a seat at the table in the kingdom of heaven. And this is a fine interpretation, but it isn't the only one. As I said, parables are complex. There's often multiple meanings. There's layers to them. And to be honest, I think this reading with the salvation component is a little bit boring. Or at least it doesn't push us as much as other readings could. Parables are supposed to make us uncomfortable. They're supposed to kind of give us that nudge we need to think a little bit harder about the world, about God. So then what else could this be about? Maybe it's a bit more practical than this lofty theological conversation about heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. Maybe it's talking about everyday things that are right in front of us. Practical matters. If we look closely at the Gospels, we see that Jesus is often way more interested in how we love our neighbor than he is in how we get to heaven. That salvation question doesn't really seem to interest him much either. Every time he's asked about it, how do I get in, Jesus? People ask him. He responds with a call to treat their neighbors kindly, with love. He gives them a list of commandments of how to treat one another. He sort of deflects back, making sure we are focusing on the here and the now, rather than relying on what Dr. Cindy Rigby calls escape hatch theology. This is the idea that if we are a Christian, we're given a ticket into heaven. We don't really have to worry about what's going on in the world. That escape hatch is a very narrow understanding of the Christian faith. Instead, we are called to care about what's going on around us, to love our neighbor, to treat them with respect and fairness. As Amy Jill Levine puts it, to those asked today, are you saved? Jesus might well respond, the better question is, do your children have enough to eat? Or do you have shelter for the night? These are the questions Jesus is interested in. Well, this parable sort of turns our understanding on its head because it reverses what we understand about the social order, what we believe is fair. It challenges our view of justice and righteousness. If it were up to us, the workers who worked in the vineyard from the very start, early in the day, would get paid more, right? We want people to get paid based on how much they work. That's what we see as fair. But God's economy is radically different. There's no hierarchy in the kingdom of God. All are considered equal. Everyone benefits from God's generosity equally, regardless of whether we've earned it or not, regardless of whether we are worthy or not, and let's face it, who among us is worthy? God's generosity is doled out just the same. So where do we see ourselves in this story? Are we like those workers who got hired first thing in the morning? What happens when we see others receiving blessings? Perhaps people that we don't think deserve them. Do we resent them for reaping the same reward that we do? Or are we like the workers hired later in the day, unsure of how to respond when we receive that generosity that we're not sure we are worthy of? Or are we like the landowner, the one who treats others with generosity beyond measure? Is it possible there's a both and here? Maybe we can relate to multiple characters in this story. The landowner could certainly represent God, showing us how God treats us. But perhaps the landowner is also a model for us, the person we are supposed to mimic, the one who shows that generosity. Maybe we're supposed to be like that one, giving out the gift of generosity, making sure that everyone around us has enough. This sure sounds in line with other teachings of Jesus, the ones that call us to love our neighbor, to care for the sick, to feed the hungry, to house the poor. Maybe what this parable is calling us to do is to act as God acts, with generosity to everyone, pouring out that generous and abundant love to all of God's children, not getting caught up in whether it's fair or whether people deserve it, but ensuring that all are taken care of as best we are able to. This might mean figuring out how to make sure all are housed, especially in unaffordable cities like Austin. It means making sure foster care children are cared for, especially with our overrun system. It means reaching out to our neighbors who are hurting, like our brothers and sisters in Nebraska and Iowa who saw devastating floods this week, or our brothers and sisters in New Zealand in the wake of that terrible attack. The thing is, there are more than enough ways for us to show God's love in generous and abundant ways. And these parables give us that nudge that we need to remember we are called to serve and to love. Dr. Caroline Lewis writes, "The good news is that Jesus persists in telling us this truth about ourselves. Left to our own devices, we quickly lose sight of the kingdom of heaven, and we simply cannot let that happen anymore. The good news is that we have a vision of the world that is truly good news, a beatitude kind of world. And the good news is that we get to be a part of making that happen, with generous hearts and love for our neighbor. Thanks be to God. Amen." This morning we are